so flat. Cool. That's fine.
Cool. Before I begin the timer, just content warning. There will obviously be discussion of lots of heavy topics in the speech, so terminal illnesses, death, assisted dying, and also just regular suicide as well. Putting that out there. Okay, speech starting. 3, 2, 1. Right. The right to control over your own death isn't a luxury or something that people are just okay living without. It's a fundamental human right to ensure dignity in both life and death, and denying it causes suffering to terminally ill people and their families every single day. 3 things in my speech. First of all, I'm going to model what the policy of assisted dying in Scotland would look like. Second of all, discuss dignity in death. And third, preventing a worse alternative. What do we think this looks like? The bill is currently going through the Scottish Parliament in terms of proposing assisted dying in Scotland. Notice a few things. First of all, it's assisted dying rather than euthanasia. That means that whilst the doctor helps to set it up, it is the patient that carries out the final act. Second of all, it's specifically for terminally ill adults with approximately 6 months or less to live, as determined by at least 2 doctors who are experts in whatever field is relevant. Thirdly, they are evaluated by at least 2+ experts to ensure psychiatric fitness to consent to assisted dying of their own volition. And fourthly, it is likely that the assisted dying itself will be concentrated in specific centres across Scotland with specialists there for, first of all, psychiatric re-evaluation, and second of all, carrying out the procedure itself, which will be carried out by a small handful of experienced palliative care consultants. I think this is likely just due to the fact that demand is going to be reasonably low. It's not like all doctors are going to be doing this on a daily basis, and rather it's going to be a pre-planned process. Okay. Let's talk then about dignity and death, because medicine ultimately is about choice and autonomy and agency. And I think the fundamental choice over both your life and the end of that life is a critical part of medicine, and that's what medicine should aim to be about. Why do we think that assisted dying is the only way to guarantee dignity in death? A few reasons. First of all, because terminal illness can be really, really debilitating. It can lead to pain, loss of mobility, a feeling of being trapped in your own body, and not being able to enjoy doing what you used to do or going where you want to go. Second of all, because you often have a choice between illnesses and medications, and medications can be really debilitating as well. If you're on opioids like morphine for your pain, that can make you really drowsy and really constipated, and also cause issues with you being able to live your life the way that you want to. Thirdly, because being cared for can be a really, really challenging process. If you can't wash yourself, if you can't feed yourself, if you can't carry out these basic fundamental tasks that are necessary for your life, and you have other people doing that for you, and you're entirely reliant on other people, it just takes away the smallest parts of agency that are important to our lives as human beings. Fourthly, because death itself is not a dignified process. The normal and natural dying process includes a lot of things that can be health medications, but these medications are not perfect. It can involve pain, it can involve agitation, delirium, and anxiety. It can involve respiratory secretions coming up from your lungs, feeling nausea and vomiting, and sometimes things like hallucinations and seizures. Dying is not an elegant thing, at least not in the natural process, and I think that people having the right to choose to avoid that is a critical thing. Fifth, because dying and being terminally ill gives you a lot of any agency or control over the direction of your own life. It's given up to doctors who are the experts in what's going to happen to you, but it means that you can feel powerless, you can feel motionless, and often the control over this choice of whether or not to participate in assisted dying, whether you choose to do it or whether you choose not to do it, gives you a feeling of control that's really important. Sixth, because you can't guarantee if you're dying naturally that you're going to die how you want to. You can't guarantee that your family will be by your side. You can't guarantee that you'll be listening to your favourite song, that you will have eaten your favourite meal, or be able to do any of the things that provide you with a sensation of closure and acceptance, or provide your family with that, the knowledge that you've died a good death, or a death that is fitting of the life that you have lived. So when you're dying, when you are terminally ill, when you don't have long left, or your family member is, that death is a shadow looming over you. That becomes the most important thing in your life, and the thing that you're working towards, and the thing you're thinking about. And when that death is inevitable, when that death is something you have no control over, when that death is linked to so much suffering, I think it's important to be able to undercut that however we can. And when we have the power to make that death something that you can have control over, something that is less painful, something where you can die with that dignity, that becomes the most important thing to terminally ill people and to their families. And that's why I think it's so, so important that assisted dying is legalised in Scotland. I'll take a point of information now if they have one for me. Okay, fine. I think the other thing to consider here is in terms of preventing a worse alternative. Because the types of people who are likely to participate in assisted dying are not just anyone with terminal illnesses. It's people who are feeling the full effects of everything I've just described. People who are feeling that to the most significant extent, who think that they have no way out. These are the people who can decide for themselves whether or not life is worth living, right? And I think that in order to participate in assisted dying, it's quite a hard thing to do because you're overcoming not only a biological imperative to survive, right? Pressing that button is a really hard thing to do because you know that you're taking your own life. But you're also overcoming any doubt, right? You're showing a repeated desire to engage in this process over extended periods of time through discussions with multiple physicians, and when it's just you and them and they're talking you through it. I think given this, the people doing this are going to be struggling a lot, people whose bodies feel like prisons to them. What are the alternatives that exist for them in the status quo? Two things. One, flying to somewhere like Switzerland. It's expensive, it's hard to do, because in the UK doctors can't legally refer you to there, so only about 50 Brits do this per year. Or non-medically assisted suicide, right? Note that thousands and thousands of people in the UK try to take their own lives each year whilst they're terminally ill, and 1 in 10 successful suicide attempts, to whatever you can call them that, are done by terminally ill people. This is an epidemic, right? Suicide of terminally ill people is an epidemic. And this is worse than assisted dying, because for one thing, if it doesn't work, then it can leave you more disabled than you were beforehand, both physically and emotionally. Second of all, it means your final moments are more traumatic, right? You lose that dignity, you lose that power, because you don't know what the result will be. You're by yourself, using a method that's probably more dangerous. Thirdly, it's traumatic for anyone who finds the terminally ill person afterwards. And fourthly, because the taboo of it is so much greater than it would be if it was a medical procedure, that means not only does the patient feel so much worse about it, but it means that they have less power to do things like tell their family, be able to prepare themselves and their family properly. And so there are thousands of people who are tempted to this fate because assisted dying is not an option for them. And I think that's pretty unconscionable, right? Assisted dying is clearly a much better alternative that saves hundreds of people from unnecessarily traumatic deaths and thousands more from the physical and mental trauma of an unsuccessful suicide attempt, and probably tens of thousands more from having their friends and family experiencing this as well. So when you give people who are working towards that death and their families the knowledge that they can either choose this way out, or even if they don't choose this, have the power to reject that way out, which is in itself a powerful thing you get the autonomy to do, I think it is the only choice to allow this. Assisted dying isn't a luxury, it's a right. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, can I get the second speaker?
Okay, just a content warning again, I'll be talking about all the similar things that Adam was talking about in his speech as well. Cool. So I'm going to be talking about two things today. Firstly, about like a holistic view on the value of life in and of itself, and then secondly, about like the logistics of assisted dying and how we can like encounter some like potential problems with this, and I'll be detailing them. So first of all, just about like life in and of itself, right? I think this is like a very hard thing to describe to people, but I think it comes intuitively to a lot of people that like people just like enjoy the experience of life in and of itself, right? And it's like we can give examples of this, of like ways that people experience these kinds of things. But I think it is like something which is sort of like natural to people. So maybe you like might enjoy eating a certain type of food. For example, like Adam detailed about how like you might want to eat one last meal. You can experience this more at the point at which you have more time to live. You can like have more fun with your friends and your family. You can have laughs with them. You can just spend quality time with them and actually just have like the experience of being around their presence, which gives people like a lot of joy in general. You can experience things like sunlight when you wake up in the morning, just like nature, reading. You can experience things like watching art, like experiencing art, films and movies, right? Notice all the things that people like extract happiness from in life probably apply to a certain extent to these people. Notice, these things are all exacerbated at the point at which you know that you have a limited time left in your life as well, right? At the point at which you think that you at the point at which you are conscious that you have a limited amount of time left, then there are more incentives for you to want to be able to like appreciate these things when they're happening to you and not take these for granted, right? I think it's very important that people are able to experience these kinds of things, right? Notice your family also will probably, or your family and friends will be able to give you these benefits as well, right? At the point at which they know that you have a limited amount of time, then they know that you then they will also cherish this like extra time more, and that's beneficial for them as well.
Lots of people enjoy the experience of life, but if that has been taken away from you and you're never going to get it back, should people themselves not be trusted to decide for themselves as an individual whether or not that is an experience that they want to continue to have?
Yeah, I think this is an important thing to think about, but I think like very often people aren't given the ample opportunity to decide between these things, right? So we think at the point at which people like have the ability to experience these, we'd like them to experience them, and I'll tell you why this is diminished right now, right? At the point at which and this is diminished for like two groups of people. Firstly, if you take the option of doing like assisted dying, we think this is like diminished at the point at which you like lose out on this extra time to spend with people. We think very often the decision isn't something which is like people can just like take and know to do, right? Notice all of Adam's analysis where he tells you about how often people have like spots where their health like deteriorates deteriorates quite a large amount, or they're having like depressive spots. I think it's very hard for these people to be able to like actually assess the joys that they can extract from life if they're able to get out of these spots in the future, right? For example, notice like people just like generally know like when you're in a depressive spot, even if you don't have a terminal illness, then it's very hard for you to be able to see like the light at the end of the tunnel. We think this gets worse when you have a time limit on your life. So people aren't able to assess their ability to take this option, right? And I'll talk about like coercion that people could experience like later. I think secondly, even if you don't take this option, this just makes your life harder as well, right? Because there's permanently this decision that you could be taking hanging over your head, right? If you have a rough spot or like a depressive episode, then this decision is constantly hanging over your head, right? This decision is probably like the hugest decision that you're ever going to have to make in your life, right? Because of all the things I told you earlier about how like good life is and how much people enjoy life. So at the point at which this decision is always an option for you, then that just like adds extra stress and extra suffering for people who are like in an especially suffering space already. We think that we want to maximize these people's ability to access a good life, and we think this is like depriving these people from these kinds of things. Now let's talk about like the logistical issues. I think there are two main logistical issues. Firstly, no thank you, on the issue of like prognoses under the status quo, but secondly on like issues with coercion, right? I think there are just like under the status quo, there are lots of uncertainties within medicine, right? So for example, there are loads of biological processes which doctors and medical like professionals don't understand. Lots of terminal diseases aren't understood, like how they work, things like this, right? So this means a few things. Firstly, people who are diagnosed with these terminal diseases might not actually have like a certain amount of time which they know that they're going to be living for, right? So this makes the decision even harder. If they even have like a doubt in their head that they can have an extra 6 months, this might mean that they make a completely different decision, and they like would regret the decision that they make if they didn't properly understand these things. No, thank you. But I think secondly, people like who misunderstand how much time they really have might just like misunderstand the decision-making process that they're dealing with, and might not be able to like access the agency that they want to make like the decision to the best of their ability. I think secondly, on this point of coercion, right? I think the state that Adam described to you makes it very hard for you to understand whether you're actually making the correct choice or if you're thinking clearly. Even if there are two doctors to analyze the situation you're in, we don't think that you can ever be in a proper state, given all of these things that we've told you, to be able to make this decision correctly, right? I think there are like many things which have pressure over you, as I've detailed earlier, but furthermore you can have things like pressure of family members. You can see them suffering when they're caring for you. You can see them like running into financial difficulties, having to care for you, things like this, right? All of which makes it very hard for you to like make this decision in the first place anyway, because you're probably worried for your family as well, right? I think because of this, at the point at which these people aren't able to make a proper, accurate decision as to what they're going to be doing with this, then we would rather these people had to enjoy life rather than make this decision in a bad way. Thank you for listening.
I'd like to invite the second speaker from the proposition.
Good evening, everybody. I'll be the second speaker for the proposition tonight, proposing the idea that we should be legalising assisted dying in support of the current bill going through the Scottish Parliament. So again, just to go on, I will be discussing the same things that have been discussed already. So my aim tonight is to convince you that assisted dying is something that we crucially need in our health service, something that is a fundamental right, as already been pointed out, that is being denied to a lot of people. Currently, under the status quo, we create a dangerous system which is harming people a lot more than proposing this system is. Is it flawed? In part, yes, but is it better than any alternative? And to that, we used to say yes. So I'm going to spend most of my speech today talking about how the previous speaker from the opposition, whilst raising good points, I think are fundamentally flawed, and that by proposing this motion, we create a better system for everyone across society. That's people that are living with terminal illness and those around them. So, if we dive into his first point, he started off by talking about the holistic view of life. That we enjoy life because of all the simple things, spending time with our friends and family, art, food, music. But I think that fails to neglect pretty big part of life, which is pain, suffering, and negative emotions. I think that wasn't brought up at all, and I think there's a reason why. I think because ultimately it starts to feed into the idea that assisted dying is a crucial tool that we need to be able to offer people ultimate autonomy and the right to a dignified death. He spoke very, very passionately about the joys of life, and I think we can all agree with that. But then, probably because we've never had to experience terminal illness. It was brought up in the proposition's first speech about the horrendous side effects that certain medications can bring, and that doesn't begin to touch on some of the symptoms that horrific terminal cancers, as well as motor neuron diseases and other progressive ailments can bring on you. So whilst he paints the picture that this is 6 months that you'd have a wonderful life to be able to do all these things, in reality most people in hospice care will spend 23 hours asleep, and they'll have 1 hour awake in which they'll experience excruciating pain and are just not living the life that was painted by the opposition. He also went on to go say that this then hangs over people's heads. As if this doesn't already, as if the idea that you're a ticking clock sort of thing. This terminal illness is not something that we're trying to portray as something that is rosy, that is comfortable. But in fact, we want to give people more control over this situation. Rather than just having a ticking clock that might go off at any point, it puts the control firmly in the patient's hands. He further went on to go speak about the logistic aspects of it. So we spoke a lot about coercion, and we think that this just is not something that kind of counts against the bill for assisted dying, in the sense that, for one, this already happens. There's already people that take their own lives sort of thing. By legalising this, we almost protect people from being coerced into it anyway. Family members are already able to take the lives of their loved ones, and this almost, by coercing them behind closed doors. By legalising it, we bring it out into the open, we can have honest, frank discussions. Yes?
Do you think a doctor can ever make a poor decision when they're analysing the patient?
Sorry, what was that?
I think the doctor is likely to make a poor decision when they're analysing the patient.
100%, I think doctors are not perfect people. But I think the idea of having multiple doctors, as well as mostly it being orientated by patients sort of thing. So yes, can doctors make poor decisions, but more importantly, I would counter back by saying that, do you think more poor decisions could be made without an outside influence sort of thing? So having that independent view bring in, I think generally works better than by having it all completely behind closed doors in this illegal shadow world sort of thing, which means that the people are well more open to being coerced. And Adam, as Adam pointed out, it then results in a lot more unpleasant death. The most effective forms of suicide are extremely violent and can be just horrific for people to experience, but also to be around sort of thing. The method for assisted dying is something that's a lot more humane than anything that could be offered by family members. So I think it's an important thing to consider that yes, doctors can make poor decisions, but overall, I think on the balance of harms, I think people that are going through these decisions without the support of an assisted dying bill are in a lot worse frame of mind. So just to reiterate the points for the last minute, I think ultimately patients deserve the complete autonomy of self. Ultimately, you own your own body. You can choose everything throughout your life. You can accept or reject medical care. Why can you not make the ultimate last decision? And whilst it is a terrible decision that ideally no one should have to face, in the real world they do. And I think by proposing this motion, we give people ultimate autonomy into their self, which is the ultimate responsibility of the medical professional. And I think it's a crucial point to say that it happens anyway, and that by proposing this bill, we make a space where it's more easy to talk about, and that there are options for people going forward. So thank you very much for listening to me this evening, and I hope you propose the motion. Thank you very much.
I thank that speaker for their fine speech, and I see second speaker from the opposition.
I would love to live in a world where everything that Gov says is true, but I don't think that's fundamentally right. Look, I think within the NHS there is a large amount of issues that it's currently facing. First of all, I think there's a high level of stress and strain being put upon it, especially coming after post-COVID. I think what this looks like is doctors working large amounts of hours, looking after patients, not having a small amount of beds, having a very few small amount of beds being available, if any at all are available, having people having to wait hours and hours within A&E, and having people have to wait months on waiting lists for specialized services. But I think also secondly, there's a high level of regional inequality within the NHS currently. I think within bigger cities, you have a lack of resources, or potentially a high amount of underfunding for the amount of people that they're facing. And in areas with the smaller cities, I think you don't have the amount of facilities to be able to cater towards people, especially when they're living in such faraway areas. I think at the point at which you have this assisted dying taking place in very few select areas, you cut a lot of people out for that regard. I think that brings us onto our main case. Look, I think dignity is a self-prescribed notion. I think you are only able to feel as if you have dignity when you describe it to yourself. But I think while only you can grant yourself dignity, I think dignity can be taken away from you. And I think that is the biggest issue in this debate. Because I think at the point of which you have self-dying as an option being available towards people, but it's being taken away or not administered fairly, I think then that is where the issue is being prescribed. Because I think you make people, no matter which decision they face, having to feel as if they're not able to make dignified decisions. What does this look like? Firstly, I think when you have doctors working long hours, when you have 14 to 16 hours on the ward, and you're going in to give a psychological evaluation in a little bit, I think that psychological evaluation will then particularly be scarred by one, the doctor's own opinions and time they spend on the job, but two, the amount of time that is being put in. I'll take your PR real quick.
This decision already hangs over people's heads. Is it better for the other option to be suicide, alone and without any help, or assisted dying in conversation with physicians who identify health expression, even if imperfect?
But this is particularly the point, right? Because I'm unsure if the psychological evaluation is happening, why people who are on the cusp of suicide, who might be suffering some level of mental illness, who might be suffering with some level to the anxiety or mental cognition that is being impaired by going through the terminal illness, why they will be the people who will be accepted towards the psychological evaluation, being able to prescribe suicide, or being able to get help to assisted dying in the first place, right? I think the amount of people who are going to be accepted into this will be highly small, like we've already said. I think the demand will be low. But I think the ability I think the issue is that even though the people who might get accepted to this are incredibly low, I think everyone who is terminally ill will at least consider the decision within one point in their life. And I think that, as Tom has already said, is an incredibly limiting decision on your ability to enjoy the other aspects that you have. I don't think this can be understated, because I think even if you make the decision to not do it, that is always hanging above your head. I think there are large amounts of people who are terminally ill currently who don't ever have to, who might not be considering this, who want to live for longer. But I think at the point of which you're having this idea being put over you, you're having this option being able to be granted to you, but then one, it's not able to be administered fairly or correctly due to the amount of structural barriers or reasons I've given you secondly. But I think that secondly, at the point of which you're having family or friends having to worry about the decision, will they or will they not make this? How are they finding their moments within life? Will they have access to it? Do we have money to be able to transport them towards this area? Will they in the final moment decide not to take it? I think this all large amount of mental stress that you're putting on these people, especially within the final moments of their life, I think if anything takes away the dignity that you're actually willing to give them, right? I'm not sure if you're able to actually grant them dignity and be able to know how they will turn in these final moments, how their future will look like, if they will be able to make it there, if they want to try and make it there, if they're always having to constantly fight within the mental battle of them against the NHS, against their friends and family, if this is ever going to be done within the first place. Look, I think there's also a level of inequality between the dignity of choice, right? Because I think, like I've already pointed out, at the point at which being terminally ill is something that limits your fact of being able to access it, I think people who are going into this already have a large amount of barriers that is going to negatively affect them in the first place. This looks like mentally ill people may be specifically negatively ill people specifically being discriminated against in a way that someone who may not be who may not have had those pre ideas of anxiety, depression going into it in the first place. I think it looks like people within language barriers, people who aren't able to speak English, people within the Scottish healthcare system who are immigrants coming in who want to try and access this not being properly evaluated against people who are able to speak English. I think this looks like people within England, Wales, Northern Ireland, people who live within the barrier, people who could cross the border, who aren't being able to access this, seeing people have the choice, you not being able to access the choice, and feeling as if your own dignity is being taken away. Go on.
Sometimes terminal illness also leads to terminal depression, because of course it does. A pill can't just make this go away. Is this not still valid, assuming that the person is of sound mind?
Look, I think that is a fair point to bring in, but I think, again, I'm not sure at the point at which this is going to be applied fairly and correctly. I don't think we have to take an opposing stance of this ever being applied, but I think we can fairly argue that at the point at which the NHS is in currently, at the point at which the UK is in currently, that I'm unsure as to why this will be applied in a way that is going to be truly beneficial for the way that Gov is going to say it is going to be done or proposed. Look, we care about dignity, we care about it being applied, we just want it to be applied correctly, fairly, and justly. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for their fine speech and ask the final speaker from the proposition to close their case.
Alright, speech beginning in 3, 2. Okay, so I think that OP is kind of lost in a little bit, right? Because I think that they have to handle the counterfactual, which is the counterfactual is these people are going to live probably like 6 more months at max. They're going to suffer incredibly and like cause a lot of stressors onto their friends and family in this time, right? I think that these stressors are probably relatively symmetric to any stresses that could arise as far as like, can we transport them to get this kind of treatment? Like, can we like afford this kind of treatment? Like whenever the affording is like functionally transport, etc. Like stuff like that. And then like, will they back out, right? I think that these things are probably relatively symmetric at the point at which at least this is like slightly shorter, and so it's going to minimize this level of stresses. Then I think the second thing is like, the other part of this counterfactual is that at least some of these people will choose to opt for an incredibly violent and undignified suicide, right? I think that this is probably incredibly bad because like we have treatments that could like help them prevent this really, really violent or at least attemptedly violent end of life, and we are like preventing them from accessing this. Okay, I'm gonna handle the NHS stuff first. Okay, first I'm gonna handle the psychological evaluation thing. Yeah, sure. Okay, doctors are probably biased to some extent. On one hand, I think it's fine if people who are terminally ill and also suicidal access this kind of thing, because I think like this is probably not going to be a dequalifying factor in your psychological evaluation if you are depressed, because I think that they probably are experienced with palliative care and understand that it is reasonable to provide an end-of-life option for someone who is going to be dying in a few months anyway, right? I'm going to start with that. Second, I think like psychological evaluations are probably going to be undertaken by doctors who are under slightly less stress at the moment, right? I think that you're mecking out a lot of things that doctors who are in like non-specific specialties have to suffer. I think that we are looking specifically at NHS doctors who in the status quo deal with palliative care already, right? We're probably not going to be taking people out of emergency departments and throwing them into palliative care because that's not what they specialize in. So let's look at what palliative care looks like and how this is actually going to reduce the strain on resources for palliative care, right? Number one, costs and funding, right? It is really, really expensive to like pay for all the medicine and all of the like treatment and things that people who are terminally ill need before they die, right? So by having an option where you can, to some extent, reduce the stress on the system, you are able to pour more funding into these specific nurses, etc., right? Now, okay, I think that this is probably a good thing and a bad thing, right? Because I think the easy response from OP is like, it is a bad thing to have doctors pressuring you into like choosing assisted dying because it's going to put less stress on their system. There are mechanisms in this bill specifically that are like, doctors cannot propose this directly, right? This has to be something that the patient wants and like desires, right? So I think that you're probably going to get incredibly minimal, if at all, pressures from the doctors to the patients to choose this kind of thing. I think this is also prevented by things like different doctors and various doctors will have on their own like ethical objections to this kind of thing. And then like secondarily, you're also going to have multiple doctors, so you're going to get multiple perspectives on this. So you cannot be like incredibly pressured by the one person you're talking to about this, because there's like at least 4, right? So I think that it's probably a good thing if we can unstress this system a little bit so that we can pour more resources into people who are also experiencing palliative care, but like maybe for whatever reason have decided that this like assisted dying is not an option for them personally. And so then we can probably make their ends of lives better in addition to making the end of life better for people who do access this, right? Yeah, and then I also think the barriers barriers to access thing is a little bit out of the debate. I think it's relatively reasonable to be like, even if the NHS is incredibly stressed, I think that the system where you have individual like centers across the country where people can go to access this, it's relatively reasonable to assume that like people will have relatively equal access regardless of like socioeconomic class and language barriers to this kind of thing. Like maybe there's a little bit of bias in psychological evaluations, those things already exist. This at least makes it better for the people who can access it without making it significantly worse for the people who cannot. Okay, let's talk about the light at the end of the tunnel, because I would like to just hit again what kinds of people are likely to choose assisted dying, right? These are the people whose like life is painful enough that it is an active harm to them to not choose assisted dying, and they have decided that the benefits of friends and family is not, I'll take you in a second, is not more important to them than like being able to plan their end of life, know how they're going to die, know when they're going to die, and like do this in a dignified way. Yes?
Is autonomy granted by the amount of options presented or the utilization of the option described?
Clarify your question with less debater terms, please. I don't understand.
Is autonomy just granted by the amount of choices that you have, or how you use the choice that you have been given?
Right. Okay. So I think that being able to have access to more choices makes you better able to access the things that you personally desire and want, right? And so like probably utilization matters more, but you cannot utilize you cannot actually access the things that you personally want and prefer if you do not have access to the choice where you can do so, right? I think that like this probably looks like people overdosing on like paracetamol and suffering an incredibly painful and like powerful death, as opposed to like being able to take a pill that's been prescribed to them to the doctor that allows them to go to sleep. Okay. Also, the development of new treatments thing, I think, is a point that we get from Rodon really quickly, but I think it's relatively reasonable. I think that the development of new treatments is slow and predictable. It's really unlikely we're going to be providing this kind of end-of-life care to people who don't know that there's a treatment in development for their specific thing, and that they could have access to a trial in some time. I think that they are able to weigh off these benefits themselves. The last thing is, I think opposition is functionally assuming that terminally ill people are incapable of making their own decisions. I think that this is fundamentally untrue. These are terminally ill adults. Even if they do have their decisions compromised by depression, illness, and all of these other stressors, they still have their own agency and their own right to decide how they live and die. Thank you.
I'll thank that speaker for their final speech and ask the final speaker from the opposition to close their case.
We good? Same content warnings as everybody, just in case I will try and avoid talking about anything particularly sensitive. Cool. What am I going to do in this speech? A couple of things. First, I'm going to outline what opposition needs to do in order to win this debate, what we've proven, why we think we'll probably take it over. Then I'm going to directly respond to both Ellie directly, and then to the kind of general point about suicide that has been raised across all teams. Then I'm going to talk about two things. First, I'm going to talk about dignity and why I don't think they show that you get that dignity. And then two, I'm going to talk about the access to resources and why this is still particularly important. Okay, how do we win this debate? I think we do it in a couple of ways, in two ways specifically. One, I think we don't show that government can get at aims. Note that all their case is entirely dependent on them proving that you actually get access to this dignity. I think we push back on this and show you why this dignity cannot materialise at the point at which you do not have the capacity to achieve it. This is particularly important when we claim that you have the capacity to achieve it by telling you these options exist, but then we are unable to fulfil them. I think this is important in terms of dealing with the structural barriers we talk. But two, I think we talk about why you exacerbate specific harms that already exist within the NHS and within healthcare in general. I think this is particularly important and kind of creates independent harms within this debate, and I think this is probably important for us winning the debate. Cool. Responses specifically to Ellie. I have two separate responses. One on the idea of doctor bias stuff. Look, note that if there is any doubt within this, according to the bill, that what they do is they move specifically to a psychological specialist. Note that the bill does not specifically say somebody with specialisms in palliative care. It just says people who specifically exist within the field of psychology, right? What I think that means is that they are probably likely to have the same kind of prospectus within it, and are probably unlikely to have the specific specialism within specifically palliative care. What I think that means then is that the biases still remain, and there is still a other voice to do this. No doubt I think this is particularly important insofar as this happens when there's any doubts. I think doubts are probably likely to happen within the people that we are talking about, because doctors are probably going to want to be absolutely positively sure that the people who they perceive are potentially have the potential of coming to this decision due to something like depression are definitely sound of mind enough to make this decision. I think the other thing as well is that, in response to Ellie, is the fact that this bill requires you to have 2 doctors. I think given the resources and the amount of doctors that exist within the NHS and the amount of bureaucracy you have to do to sign off on this, I think it is probably unlikely that both of these doctors are going to be palliative care specialists. I think one of them probably will be because it is your attending physician, but I think the second one, there is no guarantee that you're going to be able to, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get those access. Cool. Secondly, on resources, this allows me to say a thing that Wardan forgot to say, which is really nice. Cool. Limited resources are a thing, right? So I don't think Ellie can stand up here and claim that what this happens is more money is able to get put into palliative care. I think less money is able to get put into palliative care. Because note that resources have to be moved around and this policy has to be funded. There are 2 things that have to be funded within this. One, that you have to fund drug procurement. Note that within Scotland, drugs are free for everybody that uses it. People are not going to be purchasing these drugs. The government is going to be purchasing them for them. As a result, then, the government is going to have to spend a significant amount of money to get these drugs to ensure they have enough drugs for the amount of people that might want to use this. They probably don't want to have so little drugs that people won't be able to use this. In a second. 2, I think there's a bureaucracy. I think there is sufficient amount of bureaucracy to the point at which you have to do enough paperwork to prove that everybody within the loop has consent and that informed consent has been made, and to try and avoid any coercion. Adam.
Does it take more time and money for 2 palliative care physicians to engage a patient properly in a conversation about assisted dying for an extended period of time, or is it treat a patient in hospital for 6 months through complicated peaks and troughs of illness?
Cool. I think the issue here is you're ignoring the bureaucracy that in terms of setting up the systems in place in order to make this be a thing that runs in any way kind of effectively. 2, I think the drug procurement point is still a thing. But note, even if that's not the case, this is not going to be new money. This is going to be money coming away from palliative care. So I think at best all we can get is mitigation. 2, finally, response on the comparison of suicide. Look, I think the problem is that people who are not going to opt into this kind of assisted dying are probably not related within this. But I think on us, I think the worst case issue is the kind of symmetricity. Because I think on our side, we proved to you why you're unable to be able to access the assisted dying that you want, which means you're still left in the same decision of the option of suicide or the option of not. But at our worst, you feel particularly bad at the point at which you've been told this is an option, but you then cannot access this option. This brings me on nicely to the point about dignity, because note where the POI that we gave, that dignity is only a thing that exists if you are actually able to achieve it. I think we proved to you a couple of ways why they're unable to show we achieve it. One is on structural barriers. You get geographic inequality insofar as the Highlands are massively diverse in terms of geographic spread, which makes it particularly hard for you living in the Highlands in order to be able to access it. 2, in the Central Belt, because you have so many people but so little funding that exists for healthcare, you're probably likely to get massive underfunding, so massive harms in order to be able to reach this. But 2, I think there's a knowledge barrier. 3 reasons why there's a knowledge barrier. 1, you are probably aware that this decision that this prognosis of 6 months might be wrong. Note, it doesn't have to be wrong. You know it just could be wrong. 2, there's an overload of options, at the point at which that makes it harder to evaluate the options and harder to make the final whales. 3, there's coercion. Note, this is not necessarily doctor coercion, and note, this can be unintended if you just see your family members suffering and feel like this is the best way. At their best, they cannot overcome the structural barriers that exist currently within the NHS, so I think we probably win there. At our worst, we still show you why this coercive aspect exists, and this is probably pretty harmful. Finally, on the capacity for this to occur, I think we probably on our side back any policy that is fairness. I think that is fair. I think we show this policy is not fair when A, regional inequality exists and you cannot actually apply this policy in any way that is reasonably fair and reasonably just to the people who may want to access this. 2, I think the resource underfunding makes it particularly hard for this to actually occur in a way that people are going to be able to access the drugs together. I think as a result, you get 2 harms. 1 is there's a worse perception of choice. 2 is that this is particularly harmful in how you perceive yourself within the geographic inequality. That's my 6 minutes up. I'm President of the Debate Union. Thank you for coming for